30 days, not a year, not a decade, not the lifetime of patient, suffering endurance that most people assume is the price of real change. 30 days of returning deliberately to the same thought, the same specific, emotionally alive, carefully chosen thought, and something begins to happen in the mind that most people have never been told is possible, let alone shown how to trigger. Here's what you already know from experience. You have had the thought that something needed to change. You have felt the resolve, the momentary surge of intention, the genuine, this time is different of a person who means it in the moment and finds 3 days later that the moment has passed and the old pattern is back. Not because you are weak, not because the desire wasn't real, but because a thought visited once, even a powerful one, does not change a mind, it barely registers. The mind you are trying to change is running patterns so deeply installed, so automatically executed, that a single encounter with a new idea is like throwing a cup of water at a wall and wondering why the wall hasn't moved. Napoleon Hill understood this precisely, clinically, and with an urgency that ran through everything he wrote. And what he understood about what happens when you repeat a thought 30 days straight, not casually, not hopefully, but with the specific structure he described, changes the entire question of what human beings are actually capable of choosing to become. Before we go further, here's what I want you to sit with. Think of the thought you have returned to most often in the last 30 days. Not the one you chose, the one that just kept arriving. What has that thought been building in you without your permission? Leave your answer in the comments. What you find there might be the most important thing you examine today. There is a particular helplessness that comes with watching yourself repeat a pattern you consciously dislike. Not a dramatic, catastrophic pattern, but the ordinary, grinding kind. The worry that arrives every morning before the day has given it a reason, the self-doubt that shows up precisely when an opportunity requires confidence. The familiar ceiling that seems to reassert itself every time you get close to something genuinely different. You know the pattern. You have named it. You have decided more than once that it ends now, and it continues. Napoleon Hill spent decades studying why this happens, why the gap between what people consciously decide and what they actually produce is so persistent and so immune to ordinary effort. His answer was architectural rather than motivational. He was not saying that people lacked willpower or ambition. He was saying that they were trying to renovate a building by rearranging the furniture when the structure itself, the foundation, the load-bearing walls, the wiring behind the plaster had never been touched. Hill described the subconscious mind as the seat of all habit, not just behavioral habits, the coffee in the morning, the route to work, but cognitive habits. The automatic interpretations, the reflexive emotional responses, the unconscious expectations that determine what a person notices, pursues, allows, and believes is available to them. These cognitive habits are not flexible in the way a conscious decision is flexible. They were built through repetition, through the same thought or response being run through the same neural channel enough times that it became the path of least resistance, the road the mind travels automatically without any conscious navigation required. And here is the critical insight that Hill was pointing at, and that the neuroscience of the last several decades has since confirmed in precise biological terms. The same process that built those automatic patterns can unmake them. The mechanism of repetition that installed the limitation is the identical mechanism available to replace it. The mind that was written by 30,000 repetitions of an unconscious thought can be rewritten by 30 days of a conscious one if the 30 days are done with the specific elements Hill identified as essential. Repetition alone is not enough. The structure matters enormously. Think of it like a river and its banks. The river has been running in the same channel for years, carving the channel deeper with every pass, making it progressively more inevitable that the next rain will flow in the same direction. You cannot redirect the river by deciding it should flow elsewhere. You cannot wish it into a new course. But if you consistently, patiently, over enough time, build a new channel, even a modest one, even an imperfect one, the water will eventually follow. The old channel will gradually quiet. Not overnight, not in 3 days, but over a sustained period of deliberate, consistent redirection. The water finds the new path and deepens it with exactly the same faithfulness with which it deepened the old one. 30 days of repeated thought, properly structured, is the beginning of that new channel. There was a man I once heard described who had lived with a pervasive sense of financial unworthiness for most of his adult life. Not the dramatic conviction of someone who had hit rock bottom, the quieter, more durable conviction of someone who believed, in a way he could barely articulate, that financial ease was simply not his portion. He worked hard. He was honest. He made decent money at various points. But there was always a reason that stability evaporated, always a choice that undermined what he had built, always a subtle self-sabotage he could barely identify until after the fact. When he finally traced the pattern to its root, he found a thought so familiar it had become invisible. People like me don't really keep money. He had no idea how many times a day that thought ran. It was not dramatic. It barely registered consciously, but it was constant. And it was building. In today's world, the invisible thought patterns running beneath our conscious lives have more material than ever to work with. The algorithm serves confirmation. The news cycle amplifies whatever fear is most activated. Social media provides a steady stream of social comparison that the subconscious processes not as entertainment, but as evidence about where you stand, what you deserve, what kind of life is available to people like you. Most of this input is not chosen, it simply arrives. And what arrives consistently enough becomes the thought that repeats, and the thought that repeats builds the mind. The reframe is this: you have been running a 30-day experiment every 30 days of your life. The question has never been whether repetition shapes the mind. The question is only whether you are choosing the thought being repeated or whether something else is choosing it for you. Before we go into what 30 days of repeated thought actually does to the mind, it is worth being precise about what kind of repetition Hill was describing. Because not all repetition is equal. And the gap between the kind that transforms and the kind that merely passes time is the gap where most attempts at this practice fail. Hill was explicit about the role of emotion in this process, a point so consistently underestimated that it deserves to be named clearly and returned to repeatedly. He wrote that the subconscious mind does not respond to words. It responds to the feelings that accompany words. A thought repeated flatly, mechanically, without genuine emotional engagement is like a letter dropped into a mailbox with no address on it. The form is correct. It does not arrive anywhere. The emotion Hill was pointing to is not manufactured enthusiasm or performed positivity. He was not asking anyone to pretend. He was identifying something more specific. The feeling of desire, genuine, particular, alive desire for the outcome the thought represents. Desire that has enough heat in it to make the thought feel like something being actually moved toward rather than abstractly considered. Hill believed that desire was the starting point of all achievement, not for poetic reasons, but for functional ones, because desire is the emotional carrier that delivers a thought to the subconscious with enough force to initiate change. Without it, the thought is a sound in an empty room. With it, the thought is a seed in warm, ready soil. This is where it gets interesting, because most people, when they attempt the practice of repeated thought, strip the emotion from it without realizing they are doing so. They repeat the statement. They omit the feeling. They do this not from laziness, but from a kind of self-protective caution, because fully feeling the desire for something you do not yet have and may not be certain you deserve is genuinely vulnerable. It requires a quality of inner openness that the defended mind resists, and the defended mind will be the most resistant precisely in the moments when it has the most old programming to protect. The practice, done properly, therefore asks something of you before it delivers anything to you. It asks you to feel first, to contact the genuine emotional reality of what you are moving toward before you have any external evidence that moving toward it is reasonable. Hill was describing an act of inner courage, the courage to feel desire fully enough and consistently enough for 30 days that the subconscious receives it as real instruction rather than a hopeful wish. Think of the difference between a musician running scales with genuine attention, hearing each note, feeling the movement, fully present in the practice, and a musician running the same scales while mentally somewhere else entirely. The fingers go through the same motions. One practice builds the skill that matters. The other builds only the habit of going through motions. 30 days of genuine repetition and 30 days of mechanical repetition produce results as different as the two musicians. There was a woman I once heard described who had spent months trying to shift a deep pattern of social anxiety, the kind that narrowed her world progressively, that made every social encounter feel like a test she was likely to fail. She had tried affirmations of the standard kind, calm statements about confidence and ease, repeated dutifully each morning without much conviction behind them. She described the practice as feeling like reading lines from someone else's script. When she shifted the approach, when she spent time before repeating the thought, actually contacting the felt sense of ease and belonging that she was working toward, allowing herself to feel it as if it were already real before she said anything at all. The practice changed quality entirely. The words became secondary. The feeling was primary. And the feeling, returned to consistently for 30 days, began to do something that the words alone had not. The invitation here is to examine your current relationship with repetition honestly. Are you returning to the thought, or are you returning to the words that point at the thought? The distinction is everything, and the transition from the second to the first is the moment the 30 days begin to actually count. If something in these first two sections is crystallizing something you have been circling for a while, a recognition, a new precision about what you have been doing or not doing, leave that in the comments. This kind of conversation grows more useful with every honest voice that joins it. By day 10 of repeating a thought with genuine emotional engagement and specific intention, something begins to happen that most people dismiss as coincidence because they have never been given the framework to recognize it as anything else. The world does not change. The circumstances are the same, the challenges are the same, and yet something in the quality of perception shifts. Things that were always there begin to register differently. Possibilities that were present but invisible start to come into view. Connections that existed but seemed irrelevant begin to feel significant. Napoleon Hill described this phenomenon as the natural consequence of aligning the dominant thought with the subconscious navigation system. He believed that the mind, given a clear and consistently felt instruction, begins to reorganize attention around that instruction with a thoroughness that the conscious mind, watching from the outside, interprets as luck or coincidence. It is neither. It is the subconscious doing precisely what it was designed to do, selecting from the vast and undifferentiated flood of available information the material that is relevant to the dominant instruction it has received. Researchers who study selective attention have confirmed this in controlled conditions. The brain is a filtering organ before it is anything else. At any given moment, the senses are receiving millions of bits of information: light, sound, temperature, movement, the 1,000 incidental details of any environment. The conscious mind is aware of almost none of it. What reaches conscious awareness is what the brain, based on its current priorities, has selected as worth forwarding. Those priorities are shaped by, among other things, the dominant thoughts and emotional states that have been consistently running through the mind. Change the dominant thought consistently enough, and the filter begins to change. Different things become visible. The world looks different not because it has changed, but because the instrument through which it is being perceived has changed. By day 10, this shift is beginning. It is subtle. It will probably feel like something else: a good mood, an interesting coincidence, a slightly different quality of attention that you cannot quite attribute to anything specific. Do not dismiss it. It is the first evidence of the river finding the new channel. Think of it like adjusting the frequency on a radio. Static. And then as the dial moves, the faintest trace of a signal, not yet clear, not yet strong, but they're undeniably different from the static that preceded it. The broadcast has been going on the whole time. What has changed is the receiver's ability to pick it up. There was a young man I once heard about who had decided, after a period of genuine professional stagnation, to spend 30 days repeating a specific thought about the kind of work he was moving toward. Not a vague aspiration, but a precise felt image of the contribution he was building toward making. By the end of the first week, he was skeptical. Nothing visible had changed. So by the end of the second week, he noticed with some surprise that he was paying attention differently in conversations, registering things people said that he would previously have let pass without significance. By day 18, he had 3 new connections and one clear opportunity that seemed to have emerged from nowhere. It had not emerged from nowhere. It had been there, invisible to the previous version of his attention and visible to the version being built by the practice. In today's world, where attention has become the primary contested resource, where 100 sophisticated systems compete daily for the direction of your focus, the deliberate choice of a dominant thought is not simply a personal development practice. It is an act of genuine cognitive sovereignty. It is the decision to point your most powerful asset, your attention, in a direction you have chosen rather than a direction that has been chosen for you by someone else's algorithm. This is where repeating a thought 30 days straight stops being an exercise and becomes a discipline. The discipline of noticing what has your attention and redirecting it every time it drifts toward the thought you have chosen. Not perfectly, not without drift, but consistently enough and with enough genuine emotional weight that the drift is gradually replaced by the pull of a new current. By day 20, something more significant is happening, something that moves from the perceptual level into the behavioral one. And this is where the 30-day experiment produces evidence that is no longer subtle, no longer easy to attribute to coincidence or mood, no longer possible to dismiss as imagination. Hill described what he called the crystallization of habit, the point in consistent practice at which a new pattern stops, requiring conscious effort to maintain and begins to generate its own momentum. He was not describing habit in the narrow behavioral sense of making your bed every morning. He was describing cognitive habit, the point at which a new way of thinking becomes automatic, becomes the default, becomes the road the mind travels without being consciously directed there. And he believed, based on decades of observation across hundreds of lives, that 21 to 30 days of consistent emotionally engaged repetition was typically the threshold at which this crystallization began. Neuroscience has since attached specific biological language to what Hill was observing. Neural pathways strengthened by repeated use become progressively more efficient. The signal travels faster. The associated thought and response become more automatic, less dependent on conscious activation. The new thought, return to daily, with genuine emotional engagement, is literally building new neural infrastructure. Gray matter volume, synaptic density, the speed and reliability of specific cognitive patterns, all of these are measurable, documented changes that occur in response to sustained mental practice. The mind is not fixed. It is plastic. And the instrument that makes it plastic is exactly what Hill described. Repetition with feeling returned to consistently over time. By day 20, the thought you have been repeating is no longer something you are doing. It is beginning to be something you are. The distinction is not semantic. It is the difference between a musician who is practicing a piece and a musician who has learned it, between an effort that requires conscious attention and a capacity that has become reliable, available, and increasingly effortless. There was a woman I once read about who had spent most of her adult life as someone who described herself as not a confident person, not dramatically, not with great distress. It was simply part of how she understood herself, the way one knows that one is left-handed or dislikes certain foods. Personality, fixed, not chosen. When she committed to 30 days of repeating a specific thought about her own capability, not a generic affirmation, but a precise, personally meaningful statement about the specific competence she was building, something began to happen around day 18 that surprised her. She stopped having to choose the thought. It began to arrive on its own, not constantly, not loudly, but as a background presence, a quiet alternative to the old self-assessment that had run so automatically for so long. By day 30, she said, it was the old thought that felt like the visitor. The new one felt like home. This is the trajectory of 30 days of repeated thought, properly practiced. Not a dramatic transformation. A quiet, progressive reorientation of the mind's default setting from the thought that was there before you chose to the thought you deliberately placed. If this is landing with the weight it deserves, consider that the most useful thing you could do with this understanding right now might not be to sit with it privately. It might be to pass it to someone you know who is trying to change and struggling to understand why the trying keeps running into the same walls. Sometimes the framework is the thing that was missing, and giving someone the framework is among the most generous things one person can do for another. There is a question that this entire conversation has been building toward, and it is time to ask it directly. What thought specifically would you choose to repeat for 30 days if you genuinely believed that 30 days of repetition with feeling could restructure the mind that runs your life? Hill's answer to that question, and he was specific about this across his work, was that the thought should not be arbitrary. It should not be the thought you think sounds best or the one that seems most admirable. It should be the thought most directly connected to the outcome you have the most genuine desire for. The one that, when you feel it fully, produces something real in your body, not performed enthusiasm, but genuine warmth, genuine pull, genuine aliveness, because that genuine quality is the emotional carrier without which the repetition is merely noise. Hill suggested that the thought be written. He was insistent about writing not as a formality, but because the act of writing a thought clearly and specifically on paper, in your own hand, in the present tense, requires a precision that mental repetition alone tends to avoid. Writing forces specificity, and specificity is the instruction the subconscious can navigate toward. A vague thought repeated 30 times a day builds a vague mind. A specific thought repeated 30 times a day builds a mind with coordinates. He suggested the thought be returned to at least twice daily, once in the morning at the threshold between sleep and full waking when the analytical mind is still relaxed, and once in the evening in the final minutes before sleep when the door to the subconscious is most open. These two windows, identified by Hill as moments of unusual subconscious receptivity, are the ones where the practice lands with the most depth. Not because the other moments of the day don't matter, but because these moments carry disproportionate weight in the conditioning process. And he suggested, perhaps most importantly, that the practice continue past the point where it feels productive, because the most crucial repetitions are often the ones that happen when doubt is loudest, when visible results are most absent, when the analytical mind is making its strongest case that the effort is pointless. Those are the repetitions that build the bedrock. The days when it is easy to return to the thought build the practice. The days when it is hard to return to the thought build the character of the practice. Both are necessary. Neither can be skipped. Think of it like laying a foundation. The first rows of stone are laid in favorable conditions. The day is clear, the mortar is fresh, the energy is high, but the foundation is not proven until it holds through weather. The thought repeated on the difficult days when you do not feel it, when you return to it anyway, when you choose the deliberate over the default one more time, is the stone laid under pressure. It holds differently. It holds everything. And so we arrive at day 30. The thought you began repeating at the start of this experiment is no longer the same thought you are returning to now, not because the words have changed, but because you have. The mind that first attempted the repetition was a mind for whom the thought was an aspiration, an effort, an act of will against an opposing current. The mind that returns to the thought on day 30 is a mind that has been partially rebuilt around it. The channel is carved. The current has shifted. What required force at the beginning requires only consistency now. And what requires consistency now will require only maintenance in another 30 days. Here is the paradox that brings this full circle. You began this conversation asking, what happens to your mind when you repeat a thought 30 days straight? And the answer in the end is both more modest and more profound than any dramatic account could convey. What happens is not a transformation. What happens is an arrival. The mind you were always capable of having, the one oriented toward what you actually desire, running toward your chosen life rather than away from it, navigating by the coordinates you deliberately set, that mind was always available. It was always the potential. What the 30 days produced was not something new. It was the clearing away of what had been built over it. Thought by accumulated thought, repetition by unconscious repetition, over years of not choosing. Napoleon Hill spent a lifetime arguing for the extraordinary capacity of the ordinary human mind, not the genius, not the exceptional, not the specially endowed, but the ordinary mind of any person willing to take seriously the responsibility of directing their own thinking. His observation, confirmed by the lives he studied and the science that followed, was that the mind is always being shaped by whatever it is most consistently given. The shaping is never optional. The only option has always been whether the shaping is chosen or merely received. 30 days straight. Not a lifetime. Not a complete overhaul of everything you are. Just 30 days, returning deliberately to the thought you chose, with the feeling that makes it real, at the moments when the door is most open. The mind does the rest. It always has. The only thing that ever changed was whether you were the one choosing the thought. If continuing to explore what the fully directed human mind is capable of feels like the kind of inquiry worth staying, with the kind that deepens rather than expires, the next conversation is already here. Not as a subscription to a channel, as the continuing company of a question that has always been worth asking more honestly than most people dare. The 30 days begin when you decide they do.